Welcome to Pratidwani, where we try to humanize science. I'm your host, GV Pawan Kumar. It is my absolute delight and pleasure to introduce you to my guest on this particular episode, Vinita Gowda. Vinita is a professor at the Indian Institute of Science Education and Research, Bhopal, and she has been doing some fascinating work related to ecology. Specifically, her area of interest and expertise lies in the evolutionary biology, molecular ecology, population genetics, behavioral biology related to plants. This is plant centric, so there is a lot of flora associated with her research interest. She has been also working primarily on plant centric projects, which includes floral and vegetative traits in plants, utilizing molecular, ecological, and behavioral tools, and various different interesting questions related to the evolutionary process of the plants themselves. And she also advocates for research inspired by natural ecosystem, which I find very inspiring and very important way of looking at the scientific questions, which actually is of very high relevance given the fact that the way our planet is evolving. That seems to be an important aspect. She also is a mentor to many students and has been actually supervising, guiding, and also inspiring a lot of people to do research in a way which actually is very nature centric. So, with this brief introduction, I welcome Vinita on Pratidwani.
Thank you, Pawan. Thank you for this.
So,
Um,
yeah, Vinita, tell
yeah,
us a
go ahead.
little
So,
bit of
yes, I actually would have called myself just a botanist in a
botanist.
simple word. Yeah, because it's a very old classical term, not what is the word? Not fancy sounding at all. But
Yes,
yeah, in some sense, I've been trying to call myself just a botanist because and I mean, if you think of plant centric, and then everything else comes out of it, whether you use molecules or not, you're still a botanist. So in one word,
absolutely.
I would be a botanist. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's actually a very, very important terminology, which we're going to
Yeah.
come at some point of time in our discussion. Uh, Tell us a little bit about your origins. What really kind of got interested you at the formative years? Give us an overview of that,
Mm.
please. Yeah.
So I was born in Mangalore in Karnataka, but I grew up in Gujarat because my father worked in the Western Railways. He was an engineer in the railways. So I grew up in Saurashtra.
Hmm.
So I realized only recently how much of my formative years possibly played a role in what I became, or maybe the becoming part is probably more accidental, but still like how my thought process is. That probably has been influenced by what I saw. Um, so growing up in Gujarat, it was interesting because my mother was born in a farming family, and so
Hmm.
she gets married to this person who's now living in a completely different state. She's never left, South Canada, so she doesn't know Gujarati. So she's thrown into this new place, new state with a completely new language. She didn't know Hindi as well because people don't speak Hindi in South Canada, in the remote villages particularly at that time. And so here was a person who, from what I have learned from her, needed to even understand um, or needed to learn every vegetable that she was buying. She needed the name for it. And turns out, many times as a joke, my father used to call everything as ghas. So she would be like, I want this green vegetable. And she would be like, yeah, just go and say, ask for ghas. And then she would go to the shop and say, I want ghas. And the guy would be like, what is she talking about? So she had this her own trials and tribulations when she got married and as a young bride went to Gujarat. And she's clearly a fast learner. And because she came from an agriculture background and a farming family, for her, the terrain of Gujarat, I think, was quite shocking. I mean, there's drought every couple of, in my childhood, I saw multiple droughts. We would save every drop of water whenever the rain would come. And so here you're going from an absolute torrential rain, monsoonal weather, to a place where there's barely rain for 3 days. From what I now see, although she never admitted to it, she clearly missed the plants, the vegetation, the surrounding, everything. So growing up, although she was we lived in quarters in an engineer's wife, we had a cow because she just thought that was her way. Like buying cow was not her thing. So I remember having a cow in our house, and she kept it as long as she could, and then she realized this is not practical, and she let it go. And I always had a fantastic garden. Our house was always the one which had a lot of plants, a lot of annual plants, and quite a few nice perennial plants. And it was, I think, her way of connecting to what she had left. So clearly, the flora was very different. But and in the I mean, growing, having plants, flowering plants all year around in a place which has water shortages is really a feat. And when I think about it now, back in the days, it was just normal for me to see her. I now recall that, she kind of channeled every drop of water from the house and
Mm,
recycled it, and it went into the garden. And we always had a green garden and a flowering, group. And so in our entire society, wherever we lived, our house was the only one that had flowers in the house all the time. Not only that, because again she came from a farming background, she was very sort of resourceful in using cow dung in making in as fertilizer, as making sort of solid platforms for anything, and so on and so forth. So over a long period of time, now I'm starting to realize that for me, working with plants was something that I loved because I always saw her with it. And so therefore I and my sister, we were always hanging out with her in the garden. It was kind of part of our signature. We were very proud of it that our house had it. Um, and I think therefore, and also the way she talked about plants all the time was as if they were humans. So she would kind of relate to the plants like, oh, this is dying. I think I did this thing wrong. And so she would really empathize with the plants that she was planting. Back in the days, I didn't realize it, but I think now when I see plants, when I talk to my 10-year-old, I realize that I have the same tone. So in many ways, I have to say, I think having that green background in the house possibly mattered, or may have shaped the way I look at plants and the way I see them as living organisms. But in the schools, it was a very, very regular schools I went to had quite a good teachers, and so that influenced a lot, of course. And I just one strange thing that happened again. It's all hindsight is 2020. Like I in fifth standard, I think we had suddenly our school came up with this idea that we have to have a science fest, and in the science fest they just assigned all of us different projects. And just because my mother was known to have these flowers and plants and all that, so that the sister in the convent where I went to, the nun decided, one of our class teachers decided that I will build a model which will describe pollination in a dhatura flower. And I cannot tell you how um, uh, strange that is, or what is it, predictive it is. That's pretty much what I have done for the rest of my scientific life now, that I'm still looking at pollination, which I possibly started when I was 10 years old. And I remember when I was doing it, my mother helped me, my sister helped me, and I remember making the model. It was made out of thermocol. And I remember looking at all the floral parts, drawing it out, cutting it out, and so on and so forth, and describing it. And I remember while I was doing that, I realized that the flowers are such living organisms and we never talk about it. And I think it was just sort of in the back of my mind. The science fest was only for 2 days, it was done, but it kind of, it wasn't a subject that bored me or irritated me. It was something that I was quite happy with. And so I finished my schooling in Gujarat pretty much. And as you can imagine, uh, the general trend is to go for professional courses or whatever. But but I wasn't someone who was interested in engineering. Medicine was not something also in my interest because I have an elder brother. He was already in med school at that time. So I think in terms of that sibling wars that you have, maybe in the back of my mind, I had this thing of I cannot be what he already is. So in that sort of context, medicine was also not something that was in my mind. So I ended up deciding that it's either going to be it is going to be something biology related, and also like the terrain. growing up in one of the cities called a very small town. Well, now it's a big town in Gujarat called Surendnagar. It was quite a flat land back then. Now, of course, it's bustling with urban structures. But back in the days, I still remember, um, and again, I don't think it's still recorded, to be honest, or maybe it is, and I don't know about it. We would see, or I remember seeing several of these annual migrations of butterflies. And
Hmm.
the reason I noted it is because my mother hated it because the butterflies would come to her garden and would lay the eggs, and then all these larvae would eat her plants. So she hated it. So she would go into this maniac phase of removing every larvae, and I would be like, "No, you can't be killing this larvae." So this kind of this interaction between my mother hating the butterflies and rest of us loving this swarm of butterflies, flying past. Kind of, it's just a memory I have, which is just set in very strongly in my head that that those kind of phenomenon. And I remember asking many people in the school saying, "Do you know why this is happening?" And no one knew because it didn't matter to most of us. And that sort of in later on in my life, it has always bothered me that why we are so blind to these absolutely fantastic phenomenons that happen in front of us and we go to exotic places to look at these phenomena when it may actually be happening in your backyard and we just absolutely choose to ignore it. So yeah, so growing up, I think it was really my mother and some very nice teachers who instilled in sort of an accidental form these ideas that studying plants is okay, and and there's something more that one can learn from it, and so on and so forth. And I have to say, I was never pushed and to do one thing or the other. And I'm kind of a person who actually thrives when there is that freedom is given and not mentored too much. So I think the absence of pushing probably helped me a lot. That I made a choice and I have never regretted it. So yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. In fact, I want to, pick on couple of points what you mentioned. One is, of course, it's very obvious that your mother had an influence very deeply the way you thought about it. The second point is also the geography.
Mm.
If I'm correct, uh, it needs a little bit of an outdoor exposure. This
Yeah.
is something very common among
Yeah.
people who really take it up as an important point in their careers to really go deep into the research aspect. Uh, it, Given that urban environments are actually getting more and more crowded and devoid of, green, what are your thoughts, Vinita? Because a person like you who has not only internal interest but
Mm.
also a research kind of a
Mm.
program related to this, I want to just get your view. Where are we heading towards in terms of if we want to really understand how we should probably be one with the environment, so to speak. These influences, what you mentioned, has really impacted you, as I
Mm.
can
Mm.
understand from what you're mentioning. If we have to really have children grow up in such environment, and given that urban environments actually are now getting more brown than brown
Mm.
in the sense concrete so to speak,
Mm. Right, right.
than green. I just want to kind of get your thoughts on
Mm.
this particular point. Yeah.
So I've thought about it a lot. So it's very interesting though what you bring in. So I'm not so sure. Again, among ecologists and evolutionary biologists, there may be a different view of ecologists and evolutionary biologists in India versus rest of the world,
Hmm.
or especially the developed countries. Because interestingly, I consider ecology and evolution quite a high-end science, and and the people who are in it are not necessarily from rural areas. In fact, it's the opposite. If anything, they're from urban areas. So I think your success in ecology as a scientist in ecology and evolution uh, uh, does not require that you have lived in rural areas or have exposure. Well, you may probably need exposure to some kind of an outdoor environment, you're right. But
Hmm.
I don't think you need the kind of, a background that I built for myself. Um, uh, because I've seen the contrast happening as well. Um, so yeah, so I don't know, but in the sense of so yes, as a successful ecologist or evolutionary biologist, all you need is a few exposures to
Mm,
outdoors, and which of course in these days could happen through taking your kids, or school can take kids to forested areas, explain it, but this cannot be a one day event.
mm,
It needs to be quite frequent. And like I said, that constant exposure is what is more important rather than making it look like a trip. So
trip,
the
yeah.
field trip is a very annoying terminology for me because we do field work, we don't do field trips. And so in my lab, whenever a student comes or whenever we go out, I have to constantly say and insist on this terminology because it's field work. Because we're working there, just like others are working in the lab on the bench, the forest is our bench, and the risks we take to go in the forest, we get our permits first, just like you get your whatever animal clearance
Mm,
permits
mm,
for the lab work. All of that remains the same, and you're working day and night, and the risks are everything under the sun. So the risks are also equal. In the labs, you can have fires, and so can you in the forest. You can have poachers coming and working alongside, and you're not aware of it, and you can can result in quite negative interactions. Many things. So the idea is that you expose kids to constantly, such that they don't see a visit to a forest as a trip, but as a learning experience. And so it has to be work, but then the work has to be attached to fun. So I kind of constantly struggle with this with the current generation, and also with my daughter, for instance, where the insistence is to have fun. And
mm,
honestly, I don't know what is fun,
mhm,
because for me work is fun you know so I'm not able to separate these two. And so for me it's very, very difficult, and the reason I feel that for me work is fun is because I've chosen a field that I like. So I think one has to then, if you want to make a child or the next generation sensitive to these environmental issues, you have to discuss it in a positive format, and it needs to be done constantly, and you need to make them aware that this is just required. There is no choice. We don't have a choice in this. And the minute you give choices, one is always going to take the easy choice, which is concrete, because everything else is good. But then again, the idea is also to sort of do everything minimalistically. We need concrete because in parking lots we need concrete. So it's not that I'm going to fight against parking lots, but it's like, how can you integrate these issues and be okay with certain organisms living with us? So, for instance, if we are like an IISER Bhopal campus is on the outskirts, there will be snakes. And there will be snakes because we have garbage, and there'll be rats, and the rats are going to be, hunted by the snakes, and so on and so forth. So this is that food chain. We just need to accept it. So I think the fact that as scientists, and as even in the general and to the general public, if we're not able to explain something that's there in our textbooks.
mm,
Right, we write it. It's given in MCQs in 10th standard, 11th standard, 12th standard, all exams. We have this. What is the food chain? How is the energy going from low consumers to tertiary feeders, and so on and so forth, predators. These are all very, we teach it all the time, but yet we are not able to relate it, or we're not able to tell our kids that this is everyday thing. That's what biology is. So I think the disconnect is in us, um, kind of saying that this is for the textbook and this is my life. you know
mhm, mhm,
Somehow we are not able to connect our things that is written in, we ourselves wrote in our textbooks, to how we live.
mm,
So I think that it's a very complicated thing. So, but the simplest answer is that just take your kids out,
mm.
and insist in the schools that discussing about environment should be a long discussion, and
Discussion,
it
yeah.
should be a debate. Like, you want to talk. I want students and kids to tell me why you need a forest. I don't want to be telling them that you need a forest. So I think I want to hear now why you would not want a forest. Why do
Very
you
true.
not want bees? So I think I'm more in the sense of, I think it's about time, because climate change has been discussed so much, that I
Mm,
want to hear from the next generation, not tell them,
yeah.
because
In
telling
fact,
has not worked. You know.
yeah, but do you also observe that the younger generation is more cognizant to this? Because I find, at least from my own experience interacting with my daughter who is like fifth standard now, and they actually are very aware of the fact that there is something which is not good or not correct, which is happening with the
mm,
planet,
mm,
and
mm,
there is some initiative which is required.
mm,
They also kind of see that plants and ecosystem actually plays a critical role in all these things.
mm, mm.
But somewhere there is some missing link, because as one grows up, there's some kind of a clash between economics and also
Exactly.
preservation. And I'm no way actually demeaning economics. It's very important, as you correctly
Right,
mentioned.
right.
You need parking lots. You
Yeah,
need
yeah,
actually people to really get food. You need
yeah,
transportation and
absolutely.
other things. That optimization problem actually is a
Yes.
open challenge. No doubt
It's
about
it's
this.
it's a very big challenge. I mean it's what is shocking to me when I attend any conferences or meetings, general meetings, is the lack of sensitivity to how
Mm.
complex the problem is.
Problems,
I think people
absolutely.
just think that you plant trees and it's going to be done. No, it,
True, true.
or that I'm aware of green space and that absolves me of the crimes that I'm otherwise doing. That I'll plant 4 trees here and then I can continue. And so yes, you're right that the current generation is more aware because we have repeated it and said, we should talk, and also because in debate competitions, this is a buzzword. You
Mm,
have
mm.
to talk about saving someone. You're always saving someone. If you're not saving someone, you're not a nice person. So you can't discuss these things on a philosophical level. We're not encouraging that. We're just saying, just say that you're going to save the planet and you'll win a prize. And so that's pretty much why most of our kids know how to regurgitate this information, but they may not have actually understood what is the background behind it. But at the same time, I can also argue that if you go to villages, for instance, in smaller towns, people as well as kids there, right, they're going to very local small schools, unlike our kids. They're naturally aware of what is required. They're naturally inclined to do the so-called recycled methods, right? They're not taught. So I'm not so sure if our urban kids are doing any favor on our society by being a little aware. I think this is a requirement now.
Absolutely,
So if
absolutely.
so if they're doing it, that's because when they grow up, the air will be bad. So that awareness is required. It is absolutely imperative right now. So, not knowing is just going to put their generation in dire, situations. So, in some sense, I see it that way. That is,
Mm.
it's required now because we've already, unfortunately, our generation tipped it. We tipped it really badly, and the fact that we, in my generation, our generation, we're still discussing: is climate change happening? Is it not? What is the right way? And we're writing papers about it. Is evidence enough that we ourselves haven't learned? What is it that we're talking about integrating our lives with ecosystems? you know
True,
so it's
true.
a it's a good speech on a stage, but practically doing, it's very, very difficult because it requires us to resist certain greeds, and that's not easy. uh,
Very, yeah,
yeah.
that's actually a very important point what you put. Uh, so if we take it the discussion forward again, anchoring it in your own journey,
Mm.
uh, was there any specific exposure during your education, both in school and college? I assume you also did your college in the same place, or did you go elsewhere?
No, so yeah, it's interesting. So also as like a typical South Indian family, when I graduated from my 12th and I decided I didn't want to go for medicine, my father particularly decided that, education is very good in the South. So I had to move. So I moved from a city, from a very urban environment. And this is again, it's again purely accidental. And I'm purely the product of my parents' idiosyncrasies. My father just decided. So I lived in cities most of my life when I was in Gujarat, but and he didn't really clearly think it through, although it turned out to be a good thing for me at the end of the day. Um, he moved me from Gujarat, from Porbandar, where I last lived, to Puttur, which is a small town, but not even
Mm.
Puttur. I actually moved to my grandmother's place, which is a small little town. Is a town where there are only 4 buses that run and fly to the college. So I went to this college in Puttur, but I lived with my grandmother and my uncle for almost a year. And they had a farm. He's a teacher, and now he's retired. He's a teacher in a small school in the village. So I went from a complete like metro life to a village life, and which required me to feed the cows, feed the chicken, feed whatever. So I don't know. I mean, I've reasonably always been, I think, quite open to adjusting to environments. That never bothered me because my father had a transferable jobs, or he would get transferred every 3 years. So I changed schools, I changed cities. So interestingly, that also helped me in the long run. That I'm never attached to a place. I still am not attached to a location. I'm quite okay with anything. I'm quite okay with learning new things because I never had that stable sort of a system, growing up in terms of living in one place. So when I moved to the small town, it was even more drastically different because uh, you know, there was nothing really. There was like no TV, no nothing, and it opened. And so you really, I mean, I would come back from college and you would drink your tea, and then you would just sit out and just just the space, and you just look at the farm. And then I just stared. You just stare, and you slowly, it's sort of, my psyche got used to it, and I started noticing the plants, the trees. Again, it came back to it. So when I moved back, I had two choices to either take physics, chemistry, maths, or botany, zoology, chemistry. And I wasn't really inclined in physics or maths. I kind of liked chemistry, and therefore I took this botany, zoology, chemistry subject for my bachelor's. And turns out because I had good grades in my 12th, and most of the people in who take BSc do not have good grades. So it was a very interesting. I had a very nice class where everyone knew exactly why we were there. And there were very high ranking students, and there were also not so high ranking students. And somehow we it worked out. So it wasn't like it wasn't a class of losers. That was not it. They were very good students, and we had actively chosen to take botany, zoology, chemistry, and that's, I think, was a plus in coming back to Mangalore, is because overall education is respected, right? Yes, it is respected if you do engineering or medicine, but bachelor's also had its own respect as long as you were studying, and careers were sort of always mapped, as in after BSc you can become a teacher or you can become a professor. So somehow it was very normal there. So I never sort of felt like I was a second class citizen because I took a bachelor's degree or something. So then again, like this first year when I was in this village, and I was doing botany, so I had to start learning this taxonomy. And we had a very nice teacher in the college called, her name was Concepta Lobo. She's no more she passed away a few years ago. And so Concepta Lobo was a very strict, very maternal kind of taxonomist and teacher. And all of us in our class, especially the girls, we were very feisty. We really didn't understand why we had to learn plant names, and we found it very boring, and we had to, and we chucked through it in the lab practicals. She was just sort of like, she was a very mild person, and we got her angry several times. In fact, I think unfortunately my class maybe the only class where a few of us, we got thrown out of the class by her because she got so angry at us. And for the life of me, I still find it funny, and I completely can see how we should have been thrown out. But it was just, we just had to entertain ourselves in that botany practicals. And she hated it for us. So we had this. So she was one of the person that I forever am still thankful, because she was a lovely teacher, tolerated us a lot. And when that one incident happened where she threw us out of the class, she later called me. I went, of course, and apologized. And she told me this, that, I just don't understand why such, you are also brilliant girls. Why would you, get to this level where you have to piss me off so much that I have to throw you out? And it sort of made me realize that she really is a good teacher. I mean, she really, really couldn't figure out why we were getting bored, but she just knew her thing, which was this taxonomy and this description of the characters, and she would just do that. And so slowly and steadily after that, a couple of incidences, I sort of started liking the dedication that she had. and not just her, several other teachers in zoology. And so when it came for masters, then the choice was, what am I going to take? Because I had a choice of doing masters in botany, zoology, or chemistry. Again, my grades were quite good. And the only reason I took botany was because of what I had learned in botany classes in the 3 years. And chemistry always had this upper class attitude, that is, if you're very good, then you take chemistry. If you're very bad, you take botany. So I've always been sort of this person who um, uh, supports the underdog. So for me, botany was
Mhm.
the underdog, and I decided to sort of take botany because it was the underdog of all the three subjects that I was actually doing well in. And so then I ended up doing masters in botany. And during my masters was same thing. It became sort of a challenging thing, or rather, I and some of us in my class, we thought that knowing names was the most challenging thing. So we took our pride in getting into the taxonomy of things. And so that's how I
Okay.
got into taxonomy. And we had a teacher who was a nomenclaturist from Botanical Survey of India who would come once a week and give this long lectures on why a plant should be named this way and why it shouldn't be named in a certain way. And it was what was considered to be a very boring topic, or it's still considered to be a very boring topic for most, somehow was not boring for me. And
Hmm.
that's when I knew that this was something that I liked, because 98% of the people don't like nomenclature, don't like taxonomy because it is considered kind of dry subject. But it never bothered me. So that's when I knew that this is the field that I would like. And on the other hand, it was completely opposite. I don't didn't mind the molecular labs and the molecular classes or the tissue culture, those practical things, but it didn't hold that challenge for me. For me,
Interesting.
it was I always looked at it like, well, it's going to give me a job, and then what? And everyone was doing it. So for me, it was, I always had to pick something which was exclusive at that point, because biotechnology and all this molecular biology was coming up in India. Taxonomy was already going down. I strangely, sort of in maybe an internal protest or whatever it may be, I chose to continue in taxonomy, and so that's how I continue to do botany. Yeah.
This
So,
this
yeah.
uh, this also means that your interest actually have been central to your choices.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and very rarely at a very young age one actually develops that, because
Yeah.
it also needs some kind of some kind of strong inclination towards that particular topic. And second
Mm.
point is also that you should have encouraging environment
Mm.
within your ecosystem to have that,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
also means that you did mention about a teacher who did influence you to actually think about this in slightly greater way. Were you also influenced by any good books or any kind of
Mm.
any literature which was there while growing up, which played a critical role? You
Yeah.
can think of, yeah.
So I read a lot. I was an absolutely crazily voracious reader in my undergrad, and that's something that I still insist on with my students, and something that I
Mm.
feel the current generation doesn't have is the need to read books. Because so growing up in that small town, one of the things we had was a small public library. And so in the summers, when I had nothing to do, I would spend most of my time in the library and take books from there. And in that process, I actually got quite hooked on, Russian literature and East European literature. So the Kafka, Camus, and
Mhm.
Dostoevsky's kind, And I have to say, there was a phase in my undergrad where it was really more philosophy than science.
Oh,
So
nice.
it wasn't science. Yeah. So science. So what happened was, again, in hindsight, I feel this may be why I am how it has shaped me as a person more than a scientist. Is I had my science and it was very practical. Go to the lab, do it, and come back. And then I had these questions that you would read and say, why is this happening? Like, why isn't it happening? And how can you make sure this is, the social system should work in a certain form or not? And eventually I found Karl Popper's books. And so the idea of logic and, and
Uh-huh.
deductive logic and so on and so forth.
Mm,
And that I somewhere connected, sort of again, unknowingly, to what I was studying in plants and what was
mhm,
written in textbooks, where they say, this plant does this or this animal does this. And my whole time was like, how do you know? Like, what was the experiment that made you say that? And it's never
mm,
there in your undergrad textbooks, right? So it left a lot of gaps in my brain, So I was always very skeptical up until, and even I still am, of
mhm,
things I do, and I always question myself, saying, "Am I really? Am I really getting to what is happening actually in the natural world?" And I feel like that doubt in myself, in some ways, has helped me design better
mhm,
experiments, design,
mm,
ask better questions, and ask more unique questions, and so on and so forth. And it keeps me entertained, I have to say. And I can see that it keeps my students very much entertained as well. And I feel like that's super important, that you keep yourself excited uh, by doubting yourself and pushing that you get the right answers from nature, whatever that may be. So I often tell in my even when I'm teaching my class that no one likes to share their personal secrets, and
mm,
I feel that's the same with plants. They don't like to share it, but as a scientist, it's my job to find it. So it's always going to be a tussle between me trying to get that secret out and them hiding it, which is
mm,
not an easy thing. So every time we find a process, and I feel like, well, this plant does something else, and so it's this constant battle between me trying to say I think I know you, and then the plant saying I don't think you know me well enough. And that tussle results in some very interesting questions that we have seen. So yeah, so it's yeah, it's quite in my undergrads, at least, I think I was more, the philosophy of it all and the idea of doubting myself was more important
mhm,
than the science per se. And that stayed with me for a very long time. So after my master's, I had a 2-year stint at IISE in Center for Ecological Sciences as a JRF,
mm,
and then I went to the US for my PhD. And luckily, I went to George Washington University, which has a very amazing, at that point, amazing systematics program. So this is phylogenetic systematics and evolution, where it was very important and imperative that you doubt yourself, and you ask, saying, how does evolution happen? What is, so when I say how, it's the process, the mechanistically, which way does a species evolve, and how will you test it? So, we got thrown into this idea of, parsimony, maximum likelihood, and Bayesian analysis were just had come up, but it was coming up in biology at that point. So we had this long debates in the school of what is right, what is wrong. Can we even know if it's right or wrong? So whatever I had studied or read in libraries in my undergrad suddenly became kind of a piece of cake for me, in my PhD. It was quite easy. So yeah, so reading helped me a lot, and reading and integrating not just science but other factors like history and like what you said when we were talking earlier on,
mm,
the history of science, that always
mm,
helped me. I was always interested in social sciences, actually, especially
mm,
history and geography and civics. That was one of my favorite subjects in school. Science was something I was good at. But if you ask me what was my favorite, it was actually social sciences, social studies. So I think so. I always kept that interest with me, and I think maybe that's what is important. Is and again, when what you were telling me before, I think what is important is not only to encourage but also not to discourage about a
mm, mm,
subject. So in my case, I have to say, no one discouraged me. Like when I took botany, there were a few voices who said, you should be doing molecular biology, you should have taken biotechnology, you should have done microbiology. Um, but overall, no one said, but botany is useless. No one said
mm,
that. So I think that lack of too much of negative voice also helped me overall, And so I feel that that's required, to allow a child to decide what you want to do. So I feel like only if a person comes and asks me what I should do, I should be advising. Otherwise, the child should be encouraged to do whatever it is and do it well. and do it because you need sustained interest in that subject. And that can only come if it's internal. You can't have that interest. I don't think I can force someone to have an interest, you know?
No, that's a very important point, that not bringing in the negative, that's something which is so crucial, because a lot of children, probably, or not even children, even adolescent, grown up kind of students who really want to make a choice, are in the dilemma most of the time in trying to make their careers in areas which are seem to be in the eye of the kind of storm, so to speak, because
Mm,
they really have a lot of emphasis given by the society. But there are areas which maybe it is not as fashionable at the
mm,
contemporary times, nevertheless of very high importance.
mm, mm,
Botany traditionally has been that kind of a subject,
mm,
because even while growing up, it is not generally given the same emphasis for, say, let's say, if someone wants to become even a doctor, the kind of topics they generally suggest you to study is not generally centered around, let's say, botany. It
yeah,
might be
yeah,
zoology a little bit
yeah,
more
yeah.
on that side, and maybe it might actually also go towards molecular biology nowadays
Mm,
quite
mm,
quite a bit. In this kind of circumstance, and also I have also heard and seen one of the very nice interactions you have had, which the video I'm going to anyway link in this the description, is trying to actually understand how you went through your accidental journey of becoming a
yes, yeah.
scientist. It's a very fascinating thing where Vinita talks to students in IISER Mohali, where it is related to something called a scientifically speaking. I would anyway
Mm,
link that. In there, you also mentioned, that making a choice is not generally a rational process, right? I mean, so if I
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
put it as
yeah,
a kind of a summary, so to speak. This is a very crucial thing, Vinita, because many students do kind of grapple with
yeah,
this issue, right? Because they have to make decisions, and one of the main reasons why, one of the reasons, I'm not telling the reason for anxiety, is that they don't have certainty in way they would want to evolve. Uh, w- Given that you have made a career in botany, and having been also successful in really doing research and trying to encourage people doing this, you also probably hold a unique position in actually commenting on this particular aspect. See, just traditionally speaking, to be very frank, if somebody is trained in physics, engineering is generally looked at as a
mm,
as a pathway. There
yeah,
is something which you can actually head towards. Whereas in this kind of situation, I want to also get kind of a notion of your thinking of how somebody who is really deeply interested in these kind of subjects, need not be only botany, but I'm
mm,
just taking botany as
mm,
an
mm, mm,
example,
mm,
should approach it.
mm,
Of course, there are environments, encouragement, etc.
mm,
But I want to also hear it as you as an individual. How did you go about looking at this problem for yourself, and also maybe you would have also suggested it to
mm.
students, etc.
Mm. So yeah, often, of course, this is something that students often ask, like, how do
Hmm.
I know what I like? And I think I have said this multiple times in other interviews as well, that one way I assess myself of what I want to do next is when I see something, when I read something, and I hear something, and if I feel jealous about that topic, I just feel like that's what and usually the jealousy is that, well, I should have thought about it and I should have
Hmm.
done it. Then I know that that's what I want to do. So if you're a student and you're looking at a very, well-dressed person and thinking, well, that dress is very nice and, I really like it. And then I think you either need more money or you are a designer, one of the two, to either own that dress or to
Or
design it
designer.
yourself. So I often say that what makes you jealous of whom and why, and would you consider doing it? So for me, I definitely get jealous when I see a very nice paper in plants, and when someone has described a species that I was there and I didn't see it, and I go, "Oh my gosh, how did I miss this plant?" And I can see the same in most of my students. They get very frustrated, and this is true for most of us taxonomists that, like, how did I miss that this is not the same species? So that's where I know that's my thing. So if you're not getting jealous, that's not for you for sure, because you don't care, and you're doing it just because of other cursorial reasons, whatever it may be. So it's a fringe idea for you. You've waited on it, and this is something I saw in the US as well. When I was studying there, I would meet many Indian students there, and everyone would ask exactly what you're asking, saying, how did you end up? And so I worked in the GW, which was
Mhm.
my university, but I also worked extensively in the Smithsonian at the Natural History Museum. So my actual primary lab was in the botany department at the Smithsonian. There weren't any Indians when I went there. In fact, I was probably the only student who was there at that time. Even now, in the history of Smithsonian, there have probably been only two or three of us who've gone
Wow.
through those hallways as students.
Mhm.
So it's a very, very interesting place, amazing, amazing experience. And oftentimes, when I would say I work at the Smithsonian and I work at the Natural History Museum, and you're
Mhm.
working behind the scenes, the first question would be, how you're such a fantastic place. I'm so jealous. And I'm like, well, would you like to trade places? No. So then I said, well, then you're only jealous because I'm walking into this big building,
Mm,
right?
mm.
And I'm carrying a Smithsonian badge, but you're not truly jealous of what I'm doing, because if you came to my office and you saw what I was doing, you will not stand one day. Right. So that when someone says I'm jealous, and these are all people who later ended up working in the World Bank and, NIH
Mm,
and a few other places. So I don't consider that as the actual what I mean by jealous. What I mean by is something that it bothers you, that, well, how is it that this person got this result and I didn't? Or how did this person end up in this position and I didn't? I think that should be the motivation. So unfortunately, it's a negative sort of motivation in a
mhm,
way. That is, that should push you to do better with yourself. And that's how I think. So in some sense, whenever I get students who are interns and they try to argue or write in their CVs about how much they are an ecologist, and I often go that if you already knew you are an ecologist, you don't need to come to my lab because you know it. So we'll do a bigger
mhm,
project. But I would like a person to come. I'm perfectly okay with students coming to my lab, spending 2 3 months and saying, my goodness, this is some subject I will never do in my life. I consider that student also as a successful student because I have allowed the experience in my lab has allowed the student to realize that this is not their cup of tea. And so realizing what is not you for you and realizing what is for you is a very, very, very important decision.
important thing. Yeah.
And teachers and parents and the society plays a very significant role in it. And in my case, like I said, I was very lucky with my parents in some ways because they never stressed me about marriage or, when I went to the US, I think in my entire 6 years of PhD and more and postdoc, my father must have mentioned it once that maybe you want to consider, what when you're getting married, and that's about it. So I never felt the pressure to get married, and these were all things that was left to me. So I, in many ways, thrived under that freedom, of not much of societal pressure, not much of pressure to prove my subject. And that allowed me to do and explore whatever I had. So I think that truly, I mean, and I see that in myself still. I'm quite guilty of that, of how I possibly pressure my child for making decisions. But I think we underestimate how much that stress is when you're pushing a student and or a child to say decide what is for your life. Well, even you and I don't know what we want for life, right? Even I don't
Exactly.
know what I'm. So how do we expect now a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old or an 18-year-old who has a whole world open for them to make that important decision of their life? I think it's not fair. But it
True.
is the process. But I think in that difficult time, I would say that the least we can do is give that freedom to still make choices between science, arts, and commerce. And I think I have to say, luckily, in the long run, I have to say I have equal respect for all of these three subjects. And that's where our primary fault is, that we've given more importance to science than to commerce than to arts. And
True.
that
Exactly.
distinction also devalues us as human beings, saying if you're doing this, then
Mm, mm, mm.
you're not a smarter person, something like that. So I think these are all biases that we have created, unfortunately. And I have to say, we as scientists are to be blamed more than anyone else.
Very,
So
very,
yeah.
Very aptly put. Very aptly put.
Yeah.
In fact, you also actually bring this up in a slightly different context in one of the very nice talks which I also went through, and I'll be linking it. Is related to uh, something why study plants, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that's a very nice kind of WW23. That's the
Yeah.
conference
Right, right.
YouTube link. It's very
Okay.
nice. The understanding of our ecosystem through plants.
Yeah.
It's a worthwhile talk to go and listen to. I would strongly suggest people to actually go and check that out. So Vidya, we also will just get an idea of the kind of questions you have been interested in, right from your origins of your research career up to the current stage of your laboratory. Give us a kind of an overview of the questions you have been asking and the kind of projects you have been actually interested in,
Mm-hmm.
and what is the kind of motivations for asking that question and other
Mm-hmm.
things.
So when I went to, I mean, again, I think it's there in some other interviews as already that how
Mm,
I met John and how I ended up in the US. In reality, I had absolutely no connection of and no plans to ever leave for the US. Again, that was purely accidental, and I cannot tell how lucky I have been truly in my life uh, to have gotten the opportunity out of the blind to do what I did, what I continue to do truly. And I've had many very nice people, who supported it. Again, unknowing to them probably, but I met John, and and I decided to go to the US. Because I was a student from India. He thought that he wanted to work in the northeast of India, and at
mm,
that point, the political situation in the northeast was very difficult. And so, if to work in the forest, you need forestry permits, and the whole process of biodiversity laws in India is very interesting and it's quite complex. So I arrived in DC thinking I'm going to work with John and some plants somewhere else, or some plants in the US. And he thought that he got a student who's going to work in India. So we had this conflict for a few months. And till the end of my
mm,
PhD, he never forgave me for that I refused to work in India. And my whole thing was, I know the situation in India. I'd already worked for 2 years in forest. It was very difficult, for different reasons. And so I didn't want to come back for my fieldwork. So the project then that was in our lab was to look at heliconias, a plant called heliconias and hummingbirds in the Eastern Caribbean islands. And truly, I mean, there's no way anyone would, in their right mind, say no to that. So I spent 6 7 years, sort of flirting with every island and, sort of island hopping through all the island, north, so from Puerto Rico all the way to Trinidad and Tobago. Hop to every island and study how the heliconias are interacting with the hummingbirds. And interestingly, the question that arose actually came from a paper that John and Ethan, two of my collaborators at that time, had written in Science. Became a very big paper where they showed that how the hummingbird bill was aligned with the plants and so on and so forth. It
mhm,
got a lot of
mhm.
press and visibility. But there were a few things about it that I was not convinced about. So when I started the project, I had this clashes with John, and I'd be like, it's a science paper, I understand, but, and then there would be the questions.
Mhm.
So those but questions became my PhD questions. And
Nice.
again, as an advisor, I have to say, and you know this, you've written a paper in science, and you have a student who's questioning it. There are two approaches to it. You either tell the student get lost, or you just actually allow the student to do. And I think because John again gave me that freedom to say, yes, you're questioning it, let's go ahead and look at it. And he was with me in the whole process. I truly appreciate it. And that's something I learned from him, of how to have deal with students who may come with new questions that you may not like, but there may be something in it,
In it, yeah.
and that was my experience with him throughout. Whenever he disagreed with me, he sort of jokingly mentioned it about how I was coming with a interesting idea, but he never said don't do it. It would take a really ridiculous idea for him to say, I think, Vinita, this is an experiment. I will not allow you to do it. Very rare in my 6 7 years. And I failed many times on my own and I learned. But again, I also got a mentor who was very free. He gave me that liberty to do what I wanted to do. So that was my ecology interaction. But then when I came back to India, when I decided I wanted to come back to India, I really wanted to come back to plants. I wanted to come back not to interactions, but to actually teaching botany in the what is still known as the boring format, that is, understanding taxonomy, linking names to speciation, which is a very routine science in the West, but very, very few of us do it in India. And back in 2013, when I moved back, there were very few labs. Now there are at least a few numbered labs. So I realized when I came back that I needed to make space for the subject that I'm working in right now. That is, bring plants in as evolutionary subjects, as subjects where we can use them to look at how traits evolve. Like, for instance, why are the flower shapes different? Why does one species within the same group of within the same family decides to have yellow flowers versus pink flowers? This is not a trivial question. One can address it through molecular changes in the sense of genetics, or you can think of it as other expression changes. That is, some gene expression is changing the color. The chemical that is being produced is yellow colored or whatever. And so that was something that I wanted to establish when I came back. So I came back very clear with a clear idea of what I wanted to do. And I have to say, at IISER Bhopal, I got that opportunity, and I have never sort of strayed away from what I originally had the idea. So most of my lab, and I'm very particular about it because about calling it a plant lab, because when I worked with the heliconias and hummingbirds, uh, my focus was the plants. The hummingbird was the pollinator, but invariably, no matter where I went, I was always introduced as Vinita Gowda, who works on hummingbirds, and I would go, no, I work on the plant,
Plants.
not the hummingbird. So I would just say, like, look, the hummingbird is sitting on my plant, so I study it, but it could be a moth, and I would still study it. So I dealt with this for during my PhD, that I was in a botany department studying plant interactions, but people always introduced me as the hummingbird person. So when I came back, I have insisted on saying this every time, that I don't really care for the animal that sits on my plant. Whatever it is, I will study it. So it can be an ant or a moth or a butterfly or a bee. It's an animal that's interacting with my plant, but I want to bring out the feature from the plant's perspective. I want to see what happens to the plants. What is the population structure of the plant that is changing? Because primarily, I feel like we are really, this concept that I've also spoken about is that we are plant blind. That is, in any system, we always see the plant as the background, and it's true, right? When you build a new house, what do you do first thing? You plant plants because you need that green space, but you don't really care what plant it is. And if you do care, you will only care for two things: is it giving fruit that I can eat, or is it a medicinal plant? As if these are the only two properties for a plant. Right now, plants are as complex as any organism, so we don't give that value to it. So I felt that, I want to bring plants from the background to the foreground by focusing my questions on the plants. And if it requires me to talk in a very boring manner about taxonomy, I will do it. We make it more complex because, of course, we don't do the classical botany. We do sort of what we call as integrative botany. So we do a lot of molecular work and, genomics and so on and so forth. So because the system is complex, it's not that I'm trying to make it sexy or anything. It requires it. It requires that attention. So that's what I have done in my lab. So all of my questions is about keeping the plant in the forefront, and designing a question around it. So we ask a lot of questions on how does, like, let's say we have plants where you have male flowers and hermaphrodite flowers in the same inflorescence. So we've asked questions both in master's projects as well as in PhD, of when does a plant decide that this flower is going to be a male and this is going to be a hermaphrodite? That's a massive decision, isn't it, for a plant to make that? You're actually talking about a decision on sex. What sex is going to come out. So we ask a lot of these complex reproductive questions. We've asked questions about biodiversity using plants, saying, let's say, Northeast is biodiverse, but what are the factors that have caused this biodiversity? And after almost 8 years of massive work, we realized that it was actually the Himalayan uplift, which resulted in massive diversification species in that region. And the uplift was not just a single event. It was, and this is coming from geological and other climatic data, the uplift was associated with monsoonal, patterns also that changed. So both water and presence of massive niche resulted in species diversification. We've now studied multiple plant groups, and all of them show the same pattern. which means that, the diversity of Northeast now can be explained by some of these geological events that happen. So I'm interested in sort of bringing those kind of our biodiversity questions using the questions we frame, landscape level questions, and we now work in Western Ghats as well on the laterite plateaus to ask why are they so special? So we ask very basic looking questions, but which have never been asked before. But it's extremely plant centric because I feel like they deserve that spot. Yeah, and we've discussed it in many other forums as well. That if you think of the term forest, right? The idea of forest, when I say, what do you think of a forest? And if you give me an answer, hopefully plant is one of the first one. But if you didn't
Mm,
say plant, if you said tiger is what you thought of as a forest, or elephant, then there's a problem
mm,
because you
mm.
thought of the megafauna and not the plant.
Right.
And I
Right.
hope it reverses. Eventually, when we think forest, we think trees first, and then the animals. Because that's the hierarchy that I would like to set with the questions we're asking. Yeah.
Even if you look at the density and the proportionality, actually it is a flora which really represent, right?
Of course.
Of course, I'm
Yeah.
I'm I'm commenting as a naive kind of
Right.
observer. That's a very important, lexicon, so to speak, because the notion of a forest generally, of course, it goes back to narration, etc.,
Yes.
everything. That's a very
So this is
important,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
This is an exercise I often do in my when I'm going to high schools or colleges to teach. I I usually have at least 5 slides on this plant blindness, and
mm,
like let's say Jurassic Park, right? The movie.
yeah.
Why do you like the movie? Because of the five tigers and the 10,000 plants that are there in the background. But you don't remember any of those plants,
Anyhow,
right? But if I put all the current angiosperms in the background, you'll start looking at it and think, this is weird. This rhinoceros is in the wrong place, which means that the flora matters for you to
matters.
understand what was going on. So, and for us as a botanist, this was something amazing we had. So the Smithsonian had this IMAX theaters back in, they still have. And every time a movie would be released, they would call us staff and we could all go and see it. And guess what we all did? As botanists, we would sit there and we would look at the dinosaur like, okay, it's the same guy, is going to keep coming. And then we would go like, that plant is wrong, that plant is wrong, this is right, this is a little taller than what it should be, because these are all fossils, you see. So they've
Yeah.
taken fossils, they've animated into live forms. I mean, that's just absolutely phenomenal. That's the best science you can ever think of. You had five bones, or one transection of a plant, and you erected a whole thing. That's science for you, right in front of your eyes. So I often tell students that really, as a best botanist, I would like to do that, is resurrect a plant, because that tells you that you're a great botanist, because you can imagine what the plant looks like by looking at the pollen grains, by looking at few features, anatomies, and so on and so forth. So yeah, yeah. So,
Fascinating.
yeah.
Fascinating. So one of the questions I generally ask to the guests on the Pratidwan is the reason to come back to India.
Uh, to
What
come
is
back.
what motivated you to actually take up a, because I'm very sure with your experience and also the knowledge of the biodiversity in Northern America, you would probably be of very high value even there. What is the reason, Vinita, you came back?
One is that I never left US to not come to stay there. That was very
Mm-hmm.
important. I think I left India because I didn't have opportunities in India at that time in the field that I was interested in, which was botany and ecology at that time. So ecology was just, I mean, there were very few labs in the country that were doing it. So truly I had no place to go if it wasn't for these four labs. Um, the research that they were doing wasn't necessarily to my interest, because again, ecology labs in India most even now tend to focus on animals and not the plants. So I,
Mm-hmm.
again, because of my botany background, my choices were agriculture, which is the applied sciences, or go into a smaller university. So because of various circumstances, I ended up in the US. So I never went there to stay there. Even while in the US, I worked in the tropics, which is the Eastern Caribbean islands. So I was always attached to the tropics. In fact, I remember when I made this decision and I told several people around me, and they were trying to convince me of other opportunities. I remember very openly saying, and I was right then and I'm right now, is that being somewhere outside of India, working in India is going to be always a very difficult task because your applications in terms of the forest research permits, you are a foreigner. And I'm perfectly fine in that context. If the forestry looked at my application and said, "Well, you're staying in the US. How are you not taking the tissues out?" So there are a lot of biodiversity issues with that. So there was one very practical reason why I wanted to come back because I wanted to work in India, in Indian forest. When I came back, and even now for that matter, there was strong trend to work in Western Ghats because it's a hot spot, etc., very popular and all that. And I always want, again, like I said, my tendency now, I realize, even when I'm speaking to you, it's the underdog effect. So I went to the Northeast. So everyone was working in the Western Ghats, and I'm like, I'll go there where no one is gone. So there were a few labs that were working there. NGOs, a lot of NGOs work in the Northeast, but scientific labs weren't that prominent in the Northeast because it's very difficult. So I started my work in the Northeast. In fact, I started working in the Western Ghats much later. So I really liked the North. When I came back, my primary focus was also to understand what is the reason for the floristic diversity in India? Is it influenced by Africa because we were sort of, we were a tectonic plate that cut off from Africa, and if that is the case, um, is that true for the Northeast as well, which can actually be a connecting link to the Southeast Asia? So I was very much interested in bringing that connection of Asia to India, the migration of plants, which required me to either be here or in a country in Asia like Singapore or somewhere else, and so on and so forth. So practically, I was so focused on working in Indian plants that I just had to be here. The second reason was also that I have to say that despite the few people I had who helped me see the light in botany and so on and so forth, a lot of my interests and self discovery or discoveries about my interests were self discoveries. And I felt that it would have helped me if I had some mentor, who actually said that the botanical world is actually bigger than this, and that didn't happen. So I thought that maybe if I came back, I could be that mentor, and I could have a crew, whom I can train and show that this is also possible because it requires someone to help you often. Just like when my mentors helped me in a small way, I thought I could make a bigger impact by coming back and teaching as well as having a lab which focuses on this plant centric thing. So it's not that I've not been interested in starting certain other projects, but I forced myself to not sort of, go into other directions because I feel like that will be distractive, and I want to have a team of very good botanists, who do many things, not just give a name to a plant, but do many more exciting stuff with plants. And so I was very clear of having the kind of lab that I have right now. And thankfully, yeah, touch wood, it worked. So yeah, it was basically the lack of botanical information in India, and of course, and this is the interesting part. I mean, it's not that I'm the only botanist. India has one of the largest taxonomic societies and groups, in the world. We have the second largest group, in fact, in the world, and yet we know so little of it, which means that we have still not gotten out of the classical taxonomy, or we are stuck in like medicinal plant issues, or we are stuck in making floras, which is this books where we just naming and naming and naming things, but not necessarily going to the next step, which is the evolution of it. So, and evolution is a very, like I said, that philosophy, you need to have that philosophy of, why is the species splitting? Why is it not splitting? What is causing it's quite intense. So I'm hoping that, all of these questions that is so common in any Western lab becomes common in India as well, especially for the plants, because we have so much that we have to discover. And I thought that, coming back was really, I mean, there was a gap. There was clearly a gap. I mean, I don't know of any other labs like mine. There are very few labs, I would say, who do work the kind we do. So if after 13 years or 11 years, I can say this, then that means the gap still exists. So we need more, plant people coming back who can go between these, from taxonomy all the way to genomics and population structures and ecology. So yeah, so there was an opportunity, and yeah, thankfully IISERs were there and it worked out. Yeah.
Fabulous, fabulous. Uh, a penultimate question, Vinita. Uh, so, how do you find the kind of contrast and comparison between the Indian kind of botany community and the Western one, because you have a deep interest and also kind of experience in both these places now,
Mm.
not only in terms of a researcher, but also even as a teacher. Uh, uh, could you just give us that kind of contrast?
It's quite interesting, that contrast, because we Indian botanists are absolutely fantastic taxonomists. That is, we know the name, we know the morphology, we know everything about it, and we know it really, really well. We train them very well as well, uh, and that's where we stop, and then we start calling them medicinal or not, and we just don't go to the next many big steps,
Mm,
which is talk about its evolution, talk about its ecology, talk about it in a serious sense, take few individual species and do deep, research on few species. We're just so busy still calling ourselves a biodiverse region that we haven't gotten out of it. And I have to
mm,
say that's a very old story for me now. Everyone knows we have two biodiversity hotspots or three, however you want to divide it, or everyone knows we have many species of everything.
mm,
Everyone knows we can discover more species. I think we need to get out of that old idea now, because we're not convincing anymore anyone. It's already everyone is convinced about it. What we need to show is that we are good scientists in the next level, which
mm,
is asking good questions about our flora and using good methods to answering it. Now in the West, it's the opposite. Their taxonomic training is not necessarily very good. In any undergrad class, for instance, or most universities, there aren't that many taxonomy classes. So
mm.
we, for instance, have our BSc botany,
Botany,
right? And
yeah,
we
yeah.
and you always have a taxonomy. There are three papers in taxonomy in BSc and two papers in MSc if you're doing an MSc botany or applied botany, right? So anything that has botany, you'll have two papers in taxonomy, whether you like it or not. Not so necessarily true in the US or in other countries. So the taxonomy is not great. So what do? They take all our great taxonomists to identify the plant, and we stop there because we're happy
Mm,
stopping there. And then they take that identity and then do fantastic stuff that comes out in Science and Nature, where we are just stuck in the mid
mm.
as a middle author. Why? Because I identified the species and sent you some tissue or did some very basic thing and gave you the data. But we're not part of that organization of that big question
Mm, mm.
or of the analysis or of anything else. So the actual nice philosophical question comes from outside,
Outside,
unfortunately.
yeah, yeah.
That is the current status, at least. This is not historically true because we had the JC Boses and we had all these
Mm,
amazing people who asked amazing questions in plants, which to date is still super unique. So
mm,
we chose not to go in that line and chose to ignore whatever he did. And, so it's not that we've always been this. It's more, unfortunately, I think the last 20, 30 years that in basic botany, this is the situation. In agriculture, they're different because the applied aspect, they've done many good things and they're
mm,
quite competitive. But basic botany, because I think people started looking down upon that as a subject,
mm, mm,
we brought it upon ourselves in some sense. And I think the taxonomists possibly resisted change, changing into this molecular world, and evolving with the science. And that resistance has caused a little bit of sort of, falling back. And that is, we have paid a lot for it. So in my case, for instance, most of our studies is in Bonn. Like we designed the project here. We'd never send the tissues out. If there are foreign collaborators in any of my papers, that's because they have shared their tissue. And I'm very clear about it that they will come into the picture only if I need help with analysis or some experimental design or in the writing. And that the
mm,
question is always going to be ours, and that we are sort of heading the main themes. And I think it was met with some resistance early on when I joined, when I was new. But I think over the long run, that um, sort of strong take has helped me
mm,
because everyone knows that we are capable of doing what they are also capable of doing. So the abilities are very similar. Of course, when you're in the US, it's also like most universities have like five phylogenetic systematists. So there's lots to discuss.
mm.
Here, there's only
Yeah.
one, or two. So yes, the overall the number and all those things is not comparable. But I have to say, in terms of facilities in India, we have everything that
mm,
what people have abroad. So it's doable. Everything is doable. But it's the attitude that is missing. And the
missing.
fact that we are willing to get exploited in the form that we have allowed it. That is,
Mm,
I will
mm,
be part of a bigger paper by just sending a tissue name, which is actually a very difficult thing. Taxonomy is
mm.
not easy.
Easy,
So
yeah.
why we are selling that training at such low value
Mm,
is besides me. I'm not able to
mm.
understand that. So yeah, so that needs to be really strongly thought about in botany circles, actually. Yeah, yeah.
Very interesting, because these are all actually granular information which only experts who work
Mm,
in that area would be able to appreciate them. And it's always a good thing to actually do a study in contrast, on comparison. And you can see that
mm,
there are certain things which one can actually work towards as a
mm,
community
mm,
and things.
mm.
Great.
Yeah. So
So,
there's one concept that came up actually, which is like, again, to demean this, how
mm,
people have sort of put this taxonomies down is, you may have heard of this idea of barcoding, right? The idea of
barcoding,
a
yeah.
barcode is that every organism has a unique genotype or
Mm,
genetics. So you can take a barcode and it's just like you ring
yeah.
a,
Yeah.
anything in a shopping mall, you can actually
Mm,
go take a barcode of a plant. And so the concept of barcode, of course, came from the US. And the concept was, of course, from a tropical, that Dan Jansen proposed it. Fantastic idea, really important, has changed the way we started doing ecology in the tropics. But
mm.
it also started getting misused immediately because people started saying, well, now we don't need taxonomists,
Oh,
right?
man.
I have the genetic information. I
Mm,
can just sequence it and I will tell you what the species is. And that problem, like, interestingly, it was started in the West. The US understood, and most of the Western countries understood it very quickly, that while it is a great concept, still is philosophically right,
mm,
doesn't work, right?
mm.
And they slowly started to phase it out as well, but not in India. We're still talking about it. We accepted it much later, but we are
And
not willing to get rid of it.
get rid of it.
And when in fact we have like walking, talking barcodes, which is this
Mm,
taxonomist, right?
mm,
And no, we will not use them, and we will not collaborate with them, but we will use this, sort of barcode system when you
mm,
want to actually replace it with a taxonomist. So these are like sort of, again, these are philosophical questions that needs to be discussed by the botany group in India and Asia for that matter. Yeah, very difficult questions. So yeah.
yeah, it really throws a lot of light on issues what you're mentioning about.
Mm.
So, final question, Vinita.
Mm.
So, what are your futuristic plans? Like, where is your lab heading towards? What are the kind of
Oh.
questions you are looking forward to?
Well, I
Uh,
hope my lab is headed towards more of most of my students coming back and coming back as botanists, as fantastic botanists back in India, and I hope they get positions here because they're really good, well-trained
mm,
people doing postdocs outside and otherwise. So I really hope that there's this new breed that I will be
mm,
hopefully part of, contributing to. So that's my real future, to be honest. I don't see, I mean, of course, my projects will keep going where they're going. But I'm hoping that in the long run, um, I will be able to say some of these things that I'm not able to say in a talk or in discussions like this in a book. So I'm hoping that, we
mm,
will have sort of some kind of a compendium of all these evolutionary stories that we have for plants for India, you know, stories that came from the tropics, for studies that were done in the tropics by tropical researchers. So everything is homemade, which tells our stories of our plants. And the
mm,
reason why I think this is super, super important, and I've again debated about this intensely with many people outside, is because when you are someone who's native, right, who's studying the plants, you have a different perspective because you've seen the plant in the summer, you've seen it in the winter, you've seen it in the monsoon, and you've seen it across all seasons. While when you are, and this is kind of true for even when I worked in the Caribbean, it was kind of important for me to go to my field sites in all seasons. And this is something I insisted upon because I came from the tropics. But the usual trend is that most of the global north researchers, they come down to the tropics in a very specific season when the plant is in peak flowering, study it for 2 months, and then they go back.
Mm-hmm.
and the background information about that landscape, about that plant, and about that location is often not there. And I feel that that context is super important, and it can bring new ideas of how the plant is being dispersed and other features that is affecting it. So I feel like that would be my biggest contribution at the end is if I can bring these multiple stories of multiple plant species and what they do, and the story is how we say it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's our
Mm-hmm.
our perspective, as
Perspective, yeah.
opposed to a shotgun perspective. That is, I go there, I do it, study it, and come back. So we often, when we are doing field work, we interact with local people a lot and the natives for that region, and I'm hoping that and the field research assistants who work with us. So I'm hoping that eventually all of that information can go together in understanding why our forests are the way they are, and how we can interact with the forest,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to only utilizing it. So there's something, the word that I don't necessarily like is forest services. As if this forest has to give us service. And the question I think should be more like, can we interact with the forest and not just
Forest.
like extract everything from the forest because they're supposed to service us, you know? So yeah, those are sort of more long-term questions. And yeah, and I haven't done much of conservation work so far, I have to say. Uh, but usually that's the general, it's like the, I don't know, so I may get into trouble for saying it, but it's kind of the dying star wish, like when you're collapsing, you go into conservation in some way. So I will end up there as well. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, all the very best for all the ventures,
thank you.
what you and your lab actually is trying to explore and get into. It's a breed of researchers which is very fascinating. It really adds a lot more to the epistemology of everything,
Mm,
and the philosophy aspect also is very critical.
mm,
As you mentioned, the questions what you can really ask from these kind of ventures are kind of not given as much emphasis as, let's say, mainstream
yes,
kind of
yes.
questions. And yeah, I wish
Um,
you and your lab all the best. And it's been a fascinating kind of a
Thank
conversation. I
you.
should,
Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah, someone had recently told me that
Uh,
something I was mentioning about my plant and then said, well, it's not a tiger. And I kind of came out of his office thinking, you're right, it's not a tiger, but hopefully it will be a tiger. The plant that
uh,
I'm working, that you will recognize it as much as you recognize a tiger. And in fact, every plant should be a tiger, by that
absolutely.
logic, because if you don't have and recognize it, well, you're never going to save it, So that goes hand in hand, So
So
yeah.
true. So true. So true.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Pawan. It was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was great talking to you,
Yeah.
and yeah, let me know if I can help you with any other processes. So,
Thank you.
thank you,
Thank you very much. This
thank
is
you.
Pratidwani, where we try to humanize science, this time with the one and the only Vinita Goda. Thank you, Vinita.